Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Tufts Research and Data Symposium for Food and Nutrition 2022. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jessie Lan. I am a second-year master's student at the Friedman School of Nutrition and a member of the Symposium Planning Committee. This conference was planned by a group of master's and PhD students at the Friedman School, and this is the 15th annual student-run conference and our second virtual conference yet. We are excited to have more than 1,000 participants from around 70 countries. Our participants span 200 universities and colleges and 300 different professional organizations worldwide. We have an exciting lineup of panels, workshops, student presentations, and career talks for you this week. Our theme this year is on diverse perspectives, the emerging topics in nutrition and science research. Through this conference, we hope to provide the opportunity to allow participants to gain exposure to existing and emerging topics in nutrition and public health sciences, to better understand novel analytical methods and the applications in these fields. We also hope to provide a platform for professional networking and for diverse and inclusive collaboration. This conference was planned by students for students. We also had the help of some amazingly supportive staff, faculty, and organizations. We would therefore like to thank our sponsors, the Friedman School of Nutrition, Science and Policy at Tufts University Data Intensive Study Center, American Statistical Association, the Tufts chapter and the Boston chapter of the American Statistical Association, and the International Environmetric Society of the International Statistical Institute. We would like to thank their support and for helping this event become a reality. So before we get started with our keynote today, I would like to introduce Professor Elena Nemova, Chair of the Nutrition Epidemiology and Data Science Division, and Professor at the Friedman School of Nutrition for a welcoming address. So thank you for joining us, Professor Nemova.
Thank you very much. Well, dear all students, scholars, alums, professionals, who responded to this call to meet and to learn from each other about the challenges of the modern world and potential solution we are all seeking. We are very thankful for you to carve time for us to come and to share with the Friedman community your thoughts, your concerns, your passions. In these 3 days, we will share new ideas vital for nutrition research. We will share new tools and practical applications that will shape the future developments in achieving better health and well-being. We will share our aspirations for building a robust network of scientists, dietitians, humanitarians, health professionals, and data enthusiasts. This world is not recovered from the pandemics, which depleted the already scarce resources for so many. And in these troubling times, when one war is chasing another, when inequality is staggering, and when many communities are affected by nature-made and man-made disasters, I want to recite you a passage I learned from my trips abroad. In times of disasters, the old wound reopens and a new one arrives. In our polarized world, it takes guts to treat each other with kindness and respect, regardless of their intellectual capabilities, physical appearance, social upbringing, skin color, mother tongue, religion, race, gender, or sexual orientation. In times when wounds are still open, it takes so many hearts to help those who are hopeless, who are afraid to ask, and who refuse help. And when wounds are still healing, it takes many souls to keep scars from burning and help the healers. And even when the pain subsides, it takes brain to find the path to recover, restore, and rebuild in an inclusive way. When a disaster strikes again, we will not repeat our old mistakes. This conference will make special efforts to recognize our inequalities and work tirelessly to eradicate their roots. So this symposium is led by students, created for students. And in this event, we wish you all to find your cause, your voice, your partners for this very long, lifelong time journey. So again, welcome, and I will pass the microphone to Jessie again.
Thank you, Professor Nemova, for your words. And I am now delighted to be introducing our opening remarks keynote speaker today, Dr. Alison Brown. Dr. Alison Brown is a public health nutrition researcher committed to addressing diet-related health disparities through research, community engagement and empowerment, and systems change. Dr. Brown serves as a program director at the National Heart, Lung, Blood Institute, where her work centers on the social determinants of health and nutrition health disparities. She is the past chair of the National Organization of Blacks in Dietetic and Nutrition and a former American Association for the Advancement of Science, Science and Technology Policy Fellow, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics Diversity Leader, and American Society of Nutrition Science Policy Fellow. Welcome, Dr. Brown.
Thank you, Jessie, and welcome everyone. Bear with me as I share my screen. So thank you for the warm welcome and introduction, and really a huge kudos to the student organizers, Jessie and Ryan, and for everyone else on the planning team for pulling together a great agenda and diversity of speakers and perspectives. It's really wonderful to return to my alma mater, and I'm truly honored to be able to give the keynote address to start off the symposium, and excited to present on the topic of diversity, inclusion, and equity in nutrition science and public health, the racial and ethnic perspective. So as mentioned in my introduction, my name is Alison Brown, and I currently serve as a program director at NIH's National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute in their Division of Cardiovascular Sciences. And I've also served as the past chair of the National Organization of Blacks in Nutrition and Dietetics, which is the largest member interest group of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. So before I begin, I have to share the disclaimer that the content of this presentation is solely my responsibility and doesn't necessarily reflect the official views of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, the National Institutes of Health, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So to start, I'll briefly share an overview of the racial ethnic disparities observed in diet-related diseases in the United States. So overall, Blacks and Hispanics experience higher rates of obesity compared to their white and Asian counterparts, with the disparity more apparent in women than in men. Blacks are also more likely to, and my apologies, I have some animation on here. But Blacks are also more likely to die of heart disease. And although the trend has declined over time, Blacks still have the highest death rate than any other racial ethnic group. And similar trends are shown in hypertension and type 2 diabetes. And I'll demonstrate in the next slides that there are several root causes of these disparities we see and many possibilities for future research. A major limitation of this data, however, is that it does not account for the heterogeneity that exists within these racial ethnic groups. For example, the Hispanic and ethnic group is made up not only of Mexican Americans, who some have been here in the United States for many generations, but it also includes first, second, and even third generation immigrants from countries such as Puerto Rico, Cuba, and more recently, immigrants from El Salvador, Guatemalans, those from Colombia, and even immigrants from Ecuador and Peru. And each of these countries have their own unique foodways and dietary patterns. And the same goes for the Black population, in which 8% are considered immigrants and an even greater percentage are first generation and second generation, such as myself. This includes immigrants from countries such as Nigeria, Ethiopia, Haiti, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago. And this heterogeneity is also inherent in the Asian population, with these groups having different diets and cultural backgrounds. So coming with this heterogeneity, again, it comes with a variety of cultures, including cultural traditions and diets, and ultimately disease risks. So when it comes to the discussion around racial and ethnic disparities, there's often the mention of how much of it is determined by diet and health disparities versus genetics and other factors. So while there's no surprise to this audience, in his New England Journal of Medicine piece, "We Can Do Better, Improving the Health of the American People," it was posited that, and my apologies on the jumping forward, but it was posited that most premature deaths in the US are not caused by healthcare or genetic predisposition, but instead mostly on behavioral patterns. And this image on this slide demonstrates this. So in this presentation, I'll really describe how behavioral patterns, particularly diet in this context, are shaped by the social circumstances, interactions in the healthcare setting, and environmental exposures, and how these perpetuate health disparities. And underlying this presentation is the need for research to account for these factors, not only in research design, but also in the development of new research questions. So starting off with dietary behaviors, what does the literature say regarding dietary intakes by race and ethnicity? While this is certainly an area for future opportunity, in an analysis using National Health and Nutrition Examination data from 2011 to 2012, the findings demonstrated glaring disparities of intakes of many food groups. So you'll note that Blacks consume less whole fruit and vegetables and nuts and seeds, meanwhile consuming more total meat and sugar-sweetened beverages than their white counterparts. And for the Mexican Americans in the sample, they consume less vegetables and more meat and sugar-sweetened beverages than their white counterparts. And although the data aren't shown, for specific nutrients such as added sugar and sodium, most notable is the greater consumption of added sugar intake among Blacks and African Americans. But again, a limitation of this research is the lack of consideration of the heterogeneity within these subgroups. So I want to briefly highlight my research when at the Friedman School, in which I looked at the diversity in the Black population and differences in diet quality between Blacks born in the US versus Blacks born outside of the US. And the results found that a greater percentage of foreign-born Blacks adhered to the components of the AHEI 2010 than their US-born counterparts. And differences in the percentage adherence to food group cut points in the AHEI are shown in this figure, and they were significant for all of the components of the AHEI except for sodium and alcohol, with notable differences in intakes for processed and red meats, sugar-sweetened beverages, nuts, legumes, and vegetable protein, as well as omega-3 fatty acids. And in each case, a greater percentage of foreign-born Blacks adhered to the AHEI cut points. So this research really highlights the need for similar studies in other racial ethnic groups to better understand who is at most risk for poor diet quality. So now that I've set the stage of the disparities in diet-related disease and dietary intakes, the rest of my presentation will highlight the social determinants of health and their relevance to the nutrition field. So the premise set forth by Healthy People 2020 and 2030 in the social determinants of health framework is that health is not solely determined by your genes or seeking medical care, but also social conditions of where you work, where you play, and where you live. So listed here are the 5 domains outlined in Healthy People 2030. And I'll go through each domain and highlight how it relates to nutrition, whether directly through available foods or indirectly based on its influence on economics and economical resources. It should also be noted that these domains are certainly interconnected, and these factors influence who has the time to engage in research, who enters the research field, and therefore ultimately shapes the research questions asked. These factors need to be considered in all stages and aspects of the research development process. And whether we would like to admit it or not, embedded in each of these domains is the lingering influences of structural racism and bias and discrimination, which I will also mention throughout my talk, and one that Elena mentioned in terms of the wounds that we must address and heal from. So to start, here's a quote from prominent Harvard sociologist and researcher, Dr. David R. Williams. It reads, "Racism affects health in profound ways that are over and beyond any of the measures through systems that have been built up over the years and are now locked in place, replicating social inequality. Race is not a useful genetic category, but it's profoundly useful social category. And what race we belong to tells us much more about our society than about our biological makeup. And at every level of income and education, there is still an effect of race, and health disparities are large and persistent over time." So the word racism can be quite jarring for some, but the reality is that it upholds the prevailing power structures in society. It's both systemic in that it's embedded in all aspects of life and impacts all aspects of the social determinants of health, from education, our criminal justice system and policing practices, banking and lending practices, as well as housing. And it's important to note that we're all born into this history and the historical impacts of racism, and none of us asked to be. So racism in its various forms operates within multiple domains, as shown in the image. And when we think of racism, we often think of the overt forms, for example, being called a racial slur or being discriminated against based on your skin tone or facial characteristics. And some may be overt, but others may be implicit and unknown to the perpetuator. And these are examples of interpersonal racism. There's also what's known as internalized racism. I won't cover it much in depth, but this is where discriminatory practices within individuals of the same racial ethnic group or feelings of discounting one's own abilities. And this can be in the form of self-sabotage or colorism that prevails globally, not only within the Black race, but also Hispanics, Asians, and other groups. And these beliefs are rooted in a false ideology of white supremacy and the idolization of white standards of beauty. Then there's institutional racism, in which discriminatory practices and policies are within organizations. And one such example is prohibiting certain hairstyles that are known to be common among one group over another. So for example, dreadlocks. And I mention this in the context of a talk about diet to bring a holistic perspective. This could potentially influence someone's earning potential throughout a lifespan, say if they weren't called back for a job or have difficulty finding employment. And this ultimately impacts resources available for food expenses. And then the last layer is this systemic nature of racism that perpetuates the inequalities by race and the challenges that are faced generationally. And as I go through my talk, the hope is that you can see the common theme of how various forms and varieties of racism impact each social determinant of health and dietary behavior. So I'll start with education, access, and quality. Multiple components of education, including the level obtained and quality from K through 12, impact dietary choices. And as mentioned, the economic resources available to purchase healthful foods is certainly noteworthy. Directly related to diet, of course, is the notion of nutrition literacy, including a person's understanding of the nutrition facts label, the meaning of values such as the percent daily value in front of package labeling, such as cholesterol-free and high in fiber. And in the literature, nutrition literacy is shown to be associated with better diet quality, but to my knowledge, no research has been conducted to compare nutrition literacy by race and ethnicity. And while nutrition literacy is certainly important, it's not the entire picture. And I'll focus my attention on access to quality education throughout the life course and its long-term influences on someone's resources and ultimately their earning potential throughout the life course. So inequities in education are systemic, and in many marginalized communities, systemic racism has resulted in limited access to well-resourced neighborhoods and quality education. This includes access to adequately funded schools, given that school funding is often derived from local property taxes, and I'll talk more about redlining and the history of that. Insufficient funding results in fewer resources to support not only learning activities, but also student health and safety, as well as teacher support, which can ultimately lead to negative physical and mental health outcomes. So this in turn has a ripple effect on educational attainment. And systemic racism also infiltrates education as early as preschool. Research shows that Black students are much more likely to be suspended from preschool than white students. And Black students make up only 18% of all preschoolers, but represent almost 50% of all preschool suspensions. And imagine that, a preschooler being suspended from preschool. Implicit biases within educators of our education system ultimately has an impact on the long-term achievement outcomes among racial ethnic groups. And you'll note in the upcoming slides the interconnectedness of education and income. So this slide, for example, shows the percent distribution of educational attainment by race, ethnicity, demonstrating clear disparities in educational attainment. So as you'll note, whites and Asians have the highest percentage of bachelor's degrees or higher. Meanwhile, minorities such as Blacks and Pacific Islanders and American Indians had the highest percentage of those that have less than a high school education. And as I will show on the next slide, this relates to potential earnings by race and ethnicity and the economic resources allotted for maintaining a healthy lifestyle. So this graph is based on data from 2016, and it shows the median annual income of workers aged 25 to 34 by both educational attainment and race and ethnicity. And so for the most part, whites earn more annually than every other racial ethnic group at every level of education. The exception you will note is those with bachelor's degrees, in which Asians make more on average. And although the graph isn't shown, based on median income data by race of all educational backgrounds, Blacks and Hispanics earn approximately $11,000 less annually than their white counterparts. And this translates to whites earning more than $100,000 more over a decade than their Black and Hispanic counterparts. So if you're at the stage of your career or even earlier where you're thinking about retirement, if you have $100,000 sitting in a Roth IRA or other retirement accounts over the long course, that could certainly make a long-term impact. And these disparities in income are in spite of anti-discrimination and equal pay laws. And again, these inequities by race still persist. So related to educational attainment and income by race is student loan debt by race and ethnicity, which the advocacy around trying to avoid student loan debt is certainly at its height, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. But again, to be holistic in the social factors that influence diet and lifestyle, I do think it's important to note because on average, Blacks are more likely to have educational debt than any other racial group. And nearly 40% of Blacks have student loan debt compared to approximately 30% of whites and Hispanics. But to complete the picture is a matter of how much debt. So there are additional differences in the amount of loan debt by race ethnicity, with Blacks having on average $45,000 of loan debt compared to around $30,000. And note that these are averages and not medians, so there's potentially a wide distribution in these figures. So overall, a larger percentage of Blacks have student loan debt and of greater amounts than any other group. And although not shared graphically, generational wealth contributes to increased support for education from family. And home ownership in particular has historically been an important means for Americans to accumulate wealth. So for context, in the first quarter of 2020, the Census Bureau reported that Black households had the lowest home ownership rate at 44%, nearly 30% points behind white households. So historical practices and racial discrimination within America's housing system, including the denial of home loans, has certainly undermined wealth accumulation among communities of color. So next we come to economics and economic stability, which directly impacts diet given the overabundance of cheap, fast, and processed food in our food systems. So energy-dense and nutrient-poor foods contribute to diet-related diseases. And for example, an apple is more expensive than a McDonald's Big Mac on the dollar menu. And additionally important is the precious resource of time. So work time, as well as time available to contribute to the amount of time a person has to prepare home-cooked meals. So the working poor and those who have demanding jobs often may not have time to devote to cooking foods at home, which is shown to be better quality than takeout food or prepared processed meals. And I show the cover of this book, The Working Poor, by the Pulitzer Prize-winning author David Shipler, because it really highlights working American families struggling to escape the poverty system. And unfortunately, minimum wage has not kept pace with the cost of housing and living expenses in the United States, making it challenging for working families to make ends meet, which brings us to household expenditures and how much do people actually spend on food. So one looming assumption is that overall financial and economic resources equates to less resources for food and maintaining a healthy diet. So what does the data show on food expenditures? So the US Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks household level expenditures by race and ethnicity, and as shown in this figure. And you'll note, sorry, I have to go back. You'll note that as a percentage of total household expenditures, Hispanics, Blacks, and Asians spend a greater percentage of household expenses on housing, with housing expenditures making up 36.8% of total household expenditures for Blacks and African Americans. And specific to impacts on diet, Hispanics spend more on food, and Blacks spend a slightly higher percentage of their total expenditure than whites and Asians on food. And although this data is empirical, it shows the notion and the important notion that income is associated with food expenditures. And this obviously has direct impact on the nutrition field and the affordability of foods based on someone's food budget. So this brings us to food insecurity, which directly links to economic stability and to diet and diet quality. So measured at the household level, as many of you guys are aware, the USDA defines food insecurity as a limited or uncertain access to adequate food, which relates to income and financial resources. So research shows that those who are food insecure have poorer diet qualities than those who are not, and are also more at risk for diet-related diseases. And this is no surprise given the overabundance of cheap and processed food in our food supply. And based on 2020 data, food insecurity is higher among single-parent households, particularly those who are headed by women, as well as non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic households. More broadly is income inequality by race overall, which again impacts the allotment of resources that goes towards food expenses. So in summary, education economic stability certainly influences diet. Obviously, it directly relates to someone's knowledge and understanding of nutrition, but more research is needed on nutrition literacy by race and ethnicity, and also to inform the development of appropriate interventions. But more broadly, however, is this systematic racism and implicit bias embedded in our education systems, starting as early as primary education, and their role in determining someone's overall educational attainment and ultimately income available for household expenses. Racism and bias within our labor systems play a role in income inequality, And then income and education disparities, it certainly had the implications on food choice, particularly for the important resource of time, but also financially. And specific to research, time constraints are a key barrier for research participation. So next, I'll briefly mention access to healthcare and quality of healthcare, which is another factor in shaping health. So the first social factor to note is the influence of insurance rates by race and ethnicity, which has implications for the time of diagnosis and treatment of diet-related diseases. And this graph shows trends in rates of uninsurance by race. And you'll note that American Indians and Alaskan Natives are their most uninsured, followed by Hispanics and Blacks. And this has, again, implications for access to care, since those who are uninsured are less likely to seek preventative services and seek care from a primary care physician. So next, we have the factor of how people of color are treated in the healthcare system. So released in 2003, which was quite some time now, Unequal Treatment was the first major report to point out the longstanding systemic racism as a major reason for the nation's deeply entrenched health disparities. And the report found that racial and ethnic minorities experience lower quality of health services and are less likely to receive even routine medical procedures than their white counterparts. And the authors included a panel of the National Academy's Institute of Medicine, including the investigator viewed here, Dr. Brian Smedley. And a couple weeks ago, several media outlets actually covered the story as to why so little has changed since the report was developed some 20 years ago. And as Smedley quoted, there hasn't been a lot of progress in 20 years, and we are still largely seeing what some would call medical apartheid. And most notably is the high rate of maternal morbidity and mortality and infant mortality among Black women and infants in the US, which parallels or is even worse in some developing countries. So, and if we turn our attention specifically to the dietetics profession, there is a strong lack of diversity among registered dietitians. And based on the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics data, 2.6% of RDs are Black, 3.1% are Hispanic, 3.9% are Asian, and an overwhelming 81.8% are white. And this is important to note because racial concordance of clinical professionals is arguably important for care, and all the more reason why cultural humility is important for dietetics training. So what are some barriers for diversifying the field of dietetics? So one issue is the concern of race-based microaggressions. And research suggests that race-based microaggressions experienced by minority students during their dietetics training, and there's a growing body of literature exploring this topic. Students of color, for example, are encouraged to go to public health, are often encouraged to go into public health nutrition and food service, which are relatively lower paying than clinical nutrition positions. Organizational and professional policies within the dietetics profession, and while not overtly racist, lack of consideration for the influence of the requirements to becoming an RD in the profession, and that perpetuates the power structure on racial inequities. So for example, requiring an unpaid dietetic internship, for example, serves as a key barrier for entry in the field. Another systemic issue is the closing of historically Black colleges and universities and their dietetic programs, which served as a key pipeline for training of African-American dietitians, particularly in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But since the 1970s, there has been a significant disinvestment in state-based HBCUs, which has contributed to the decline in Black RDs. So the inequities in the dietetics profession are prime examples of how organizational policies, practices, and decisions maintain the status quo and do not truly embody a racial equity lens. So then there's where someone lives in their neighborhood and built environment, and that largely influences someone's diet. So in rural communities, grocery stores are limited and people may not have access to a car or have to drive miles to access foods. And these are called food deserts, which of course with this audience you are well aware. And while food deserts are most common in rural communities, they also occur in certain urban and suburban communities as well. Food swamps where there's an overabundance of fast food outlets are commonplace in urban and suburban communities of color. And urban neighborhoods often include an abundance of corner stores with limited availability of quality and affordable produce and healthy foods. And racial segregation in urban communities is also an important influence. And as demonstrated in the next few slides, the systemic racist practice of redlining has had lingering effects on segregation throughout the US. And although I don't discuss this thoroughly in my talk, environment in the workplace and in schools also determines what's available to eat. And place of work and type of work also influences the time and ability to eat regularly throughout the day. So the images on this slide are from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and they show that the life expectancy in neighborhoods throughout the DC and Minneapolis areas. And zip code has been shown to be a good predictor of health outcomes. And if you've lived or traveled throughout the US, these disparities in equitable resources across different neighborhoods are quite glaring. So when I used to go to school in Southwest Atlanta at the HBCU Spelman College, that area of Atlanta was riddled with fast food restaurants. Walking distance from the campus was Bojangles, Taco Bell, you name it. And if you drive or take the public transportation, 5 stops, just a little 5 points or Beckhead, it was a completely different experience in terms of what was available for food options. And for the next few slides, I'll focus on the history underscoring why your zip code is such a good predictor of your health. So the images here are redlining maps of New York City, Oakland, and Minneapolis. And a 1930s housing policy known as redlining had such a major racial implications that even as it was outlawed in the 1960s, it truly continues to have a lasting effect on social and community boundaries. And specifically, redlining was a practice of denying mortgages to people, mostly people of color, in certain neighborhoods. And it resulted in kind of these clear, distinctive lines by race in certain neighborhoods. And again, although it's been outlawed for decades, its scars remain visible. And as Elena mentioned, the wounds remain visible throughout many communities across the US. So in a New York Times article from 2015, they highlighted racial segregation that persists today. And for those who are familiar with these different cities, again, New York, Washington, DC, Philadelphia, who here in the chat box would like to share what dot they think represents which racial group? So if you will take a moment to put your thoughts in the chat on, based on your experience, what dot do you think is the blue dot? What dot do you think green represents? What dot do you think red represents? And so forth. So, okay, we have from Brianna, the green would be white, and that is correct. If you're familiar with New York City, you'll be well aware of that. Blue is Black, green is white, blue is African American. So if you're familiar with New York City, you know on the Lower East Side of Manhattan is Chinatown, where there's a large population of Asian immigrants, not just Chinese, but other immigrant groups as well. And, you know, throughout Manhattan and Midtown, even Lower Manhattan, it's predominantly white and Caucasians, and then blue would be African American. There's a higher percentage of African Americans, not only in the Bronx, but also throughout Brooklyn. And then the orange dot represents the Hispanic population. So again, from Washington, D.C. to Chicago and Houston, racial and ethnic segregation is commonplace. So the influence of redlining on food access and community resource allocation has also been documented in the research literature. So I just highlight a few examples here. So it certainly has implications for the nutrition field. So I'll now discuss how one's social and cultural experiences and networks and community contributes to dietary choices. So cultural upbringing and foods that you were raised on certainly play a role into your dietary preferences. But beyond this is also your Western culture and how this influences diet. Stress and exposure to discrimination can also arguably contribute to stress eating and other coping behaviors. So when we think of those of different racial ethnic groups in the context of diet, we may think of the cultural cuisines that are indigenous to regions across the globe. So cultural upbringing and where someone is born certainly plays a role in their diet. And this slide represents foods from across the globe. So when we think of traditional Chinese cuisine, we may think of wonton soup and steamed dumplings, or a goosey stew if you're thinking of Nigerian dishes. But being aware of these dishes is just the first step of cultural sensitivity and humility when working with racially and ethnically diverse populations. And this is very much specific to immigrant populations, as well as first and second generation immigrants. But if you look on this slide and across many cultural cuisines, in many cases, these diets are abundant in fruits and vegetables, and many cultures have strengths in their cultural diets. And an important thing to consider in research when working in ethnically and racially diverse populations, and again, particularly in immigrant communities, the important thing to consider is the acculturation process and whether or not someone actually eats the diets of their cultural background. And this is influenced by a variety of factors, whether or not they migrate to a cultural enclave where there's a large population, and their personal preference for their cultural diets. And then cultural diets may also have varying impacts on first and second generation Americans as well. But arguably the most impactful culture on the average person's diet in the US is the Westernized diet, and that's indicated here. So time-constrained individuals and families rely more and more on takeout food than home-cooked meals. Because of economic constraints, those of economic status who are time-constrained are more reliant most times on these food options. And this is compounded by what's available in one's neighborhood and community, and particularly if they don't have access to transportation. Marketing of, again, sugar-sweetened beverages and that industry have also become pervasive, and serving sizes have ballooned, and increasing intakes has ballooned thereafter. So not only have calories increased as well, but also saturated fats, sodium, and refined grains. Also, a thing to consider is marketing. So in 2015, a report published by the Red Center for Food Policy and Obesity in collaboration with many different organizations, so the African American Collaborative on Obesity Research, which is now the Council on Black Health, as well as Salute America, they found that compared to non-Hispanic white youth, Black and Hispanic youth were exposed to more food advertising in the media, as well as more marketing messages in their communities. And although the researchers didn't conduct nutritional analysis of the brands, most of the advertised foods targeted to Hispanics and Black consumers promoted mostly nutritionally poor food and beverages. So in our capitalistic society, in which businesses are free to target to the most marketable and lucrative consumer, one has to ask which comes first and what is actually ethical. What influences what? For example, Black and Hispanic youth are known to consume more sugar-sweetened beverages than their white counterparts, but you must ask yourself, what is the influencing factor in this behavior? So that is certainly an interesting research question that could be pursued. And while this practice of targeted marketing may not be overly racist, it does demonstrate how organizational practices do not integrate a health and racial equity lens. So another social factor that I would be remiss to not mention is policing policies and practices within this country. So the killing of George Floyd in 2020, at a time when most of the world was in quarantine and left with no convenient distractions of the realities of police brutality in the US, it set a ripple effect across the nation, and it led to many industries here in the US, but also elsewhere, to really reflect on diversity, inclusion, and equity within their organization. I remember during that time, Netflix even had a special channel on, or a special category, if you will, on Black programming and so forth. And every organization type across the country really focused on inclusion, diversity, and equity at that time. And it's still continuing today, gratefully. So the killing of Black men and women is an overt way that interpersonal racism plays out in our society, but the disproportionate incarceration of Black and American Indian and other people of color is another noteworthy structural form of racism that is embedded in our policies. So, for example, the three-strike law policy that was implemented in the 1980s and early 1990s, it set forth that if someone had three charges against them, that they would be imprisoned. But it also included stronger sentencing for crack cocaine compared to cocaine. And even though they're made from the same addictive substance, it's a prime example of how structural racism has manifested itself in the judicial system, because crack cocaine was often used in minority communities and was cheaper in comparison to cocaine. And I bring this up in the context of diet-related diseases because of its relationship with this destabilizing the household. So if a father, for example, is incarcerated and can no longer provide financially for his family, this destabilizes the household, contributing to time constraints of the single parent and resource constraints provided for their family. So this is evidenced by the higher rates of food insecurity among single parent households. And I mention this not to perpetuate stereotypes of the absent father paradigm, but to also demonstrate how, again, systemic racism in practices and policies seemingly unrelated to the nutrition field, in fact, contributes to diet-related disparities. So, and lastly, I'll mention the impact of psychological stress. So stress and elevated cortisol levels are known to be associated with poor health outcomes. And the concept of allostatic load, which is the accumulation of stress over time, has been shown to be higher among racial ethnic minorities. And in terms of the exact link between race and ethnicity and stress and its direct link to diet, more research is needed in this area, particularly around emotional eating, skip meals, and binge eating. A few small studies among Native Americans and African Americans have demonstrated the link between racism-related stress, trauma, and binge eating. And actually, a recent study published this year in Appetite found that after adjusting for age, ethnicity, and race, gender, and socioeconomic status, moderate and high levels of discriminatory experiences were each associated with a significantly greater prevalence of binge eating and lower intuitive and mindful eating scores. So overall, the influence of race-related stress on dietary practices and behaviors is an interesting area of research in which more studies are needed. So now that I've covered the 5 social determinants of health, I will end with why diversity, equity, and inclusion are critical for nutrition science and public health, including research as well as in training and training the next generation of practitioners, public health professionals, and researchers. So briefly, what is diversity? Diversity is defined as acknowledging, understanding, and accepting, and valuing, and celebrating differences among people among a variety of different characteristics. So I'm highlighting race and ethnicity since that's the focus of my presentation. But diversity is deeper than physical attributes, as many of you guys are aware. And this is highlighted in the image on the right. The traits of diversity that are beneath the surface and not visible include your socioeconomic status, your religion, your education and ethnicity, your culture and beliefs and values. And these you wouldn't know unless you got to know a person or spoke to them. And there's also a concept known as intersectionality. And this was coined by a Black feminist scholar, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, in the late 1980s. And it calls for understanding how various aspects of a person's social and political identity combines to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. And I won't go into depth here, but it really urges us to think of how someone's various social identities and how these contribute to their experiences in the world. So diversity is important for a variety of reasons. In business, it's thought to increase marketing opportunities, recruitment, and creativity and business image. In both research and in training the next generation of professionals, it's also important. So in research teams, for example, diversity brings a richness in perspectives, including different ideas and approaches to a problem or scientific question. And specific to study populations, diversity can enhance the validity and generalizability of the research findings to the real world. Now, in the training context, diversity and respect for individual differences can increase the productivity of teams, and diversity introduces a diversity of lived experiences that can truly enhance the learning environment. So next we come to the importance of inclusion. And it's one thing to have racial and ethnic diversity and support diversity, but perhaps even more important is the assurance that the environment is inclusive of those of diverse backgrounds. So in the context of a research study, this relates to how our research assistants may interact with the study participant during the data collection process. Meanwhile, in the academic setting, it relates to the experiences of students of color in the academic environment. So tying back to the image shared earlier in the presentation about the different forms of racism, I wanted to highlight that here. So inclusion relates to the interpersonal racism, which is relevant to topics such as discrimination, prejudices, as well as bias. So bias is defined as disproportionate weight in favor of or against an idea or thing, usually in a way that is closed-minded, prejudiced, or unfair. And an important thing to note is that we all are born into this history of racism again, and none of us have asked to be so. And although my presentation is very US-centric, racism and ethnocentrism is very much a global phenomenon. But specific to bias, it typically characterizes as either explicit or implicit. Explicit bias is also known as conscious bias, and it's when individuals are aware of their prejudices and attitudes towards certain groups. For example, this could include the bias that African American students are less knowledgeable or motivated, or that Asian students are smart and competent and hardworking. And meanwhile, implicit bias is more unconscious and is described as when individuals are unaware of how their understanding and actions and decisions affect certain groups. But again, one thing to note is that we all have biases, but it's whether or not we recognize them that can lead to bad decisions at work, in life, and in relationships. So biases are deep-rooted and often perpetuated in the media and other social settings. Unconscious bias is that moment when a stereotype may pop in your mind, and what psychologists say is a tendency for stereotype confirming thoughts to pass spontaneously through our minds, and as a result of your brain noticing patterns and making generalizations. And it really sets people up to certain types of overgeneralizations, and sometimes leads to discrimination, even when people feel they're being fair. The key to overcoming these stereotypes and combating the implicit biases that we may have is self-awareness and understanding these implicit biases, and also reducing any microaggressions, which I'll cover in the next slide. So in 2007, a team of researchers at Teachers College published an article that still holds much relevance today on racial microaggressions in everyday life. And in this publication, they highlight 8 different forms of racial microaggressions that people commonly make, but again, are unaware of how it may be perceived by those who are on the receiving end. And microaggressions are defined as commonplace verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities that communicates hostile, derogatory, or even negative insults towards a certain group. And I won't go through all of these, but we'll highlight a few. So for the category of alien in your own land, an example would be asking someone who appears to be Asian or Hispanic where they're from, or if they speak, or saying that they speak good English, assuming that they are foreign born. This sends the message that you're not American and that you're a foreigner, which in fact, many Asians and Latinos are second and even third generation Americans. Or in terms of description of intelligence, telling someone that they're so articulate, which sends the message that people of color are generally not as intelligent as whites. So I won't go through all of these for the purpose of time, but I wanted you guys to be aware of these different microaggressions, and I really encourage you to read the original publication that's listed here. So finally, we come to equity. And just to describe the importance of equity, I'm using this infographic from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and it highlights the distinction between equity and equality. And many of you may have already seen this, but in each case, we have individuals with distinct needs. We have a tall individual, someone who's in a wheelchair, a young child. And in a world of equality, everyone will be given the same bike to ride despite their abilities and characteristics. Conversely, in equity, everyone is given a bike that fits their needs. And unlike equality, equity includes an element of fairness and justice. So equity in research includes authentic community stakeholder engagement in the development of the study interventions, and then assessing the landscape of the community you're working in by gathering the true lived experiences and perspectives of people affected by your research. It also includes disaggregating data in the data analysis process to see if there are any differences or connections across groups. And then to increase diversity in study populations, it's important to have participant-focused data collection processes and meeting people where they are to collect data. So partnering with local organizations could be a way to do this. And then also leveraging virtual options as well for time-constrained individuals. And lastly, includes dissemination of research findings within the communities that you're working in so that the community can act on or use the research findings. And then in training, it includes providing mentorship programs for students of color. And Dr. Sarah Folta, the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at the Friedman School, will be highlighting Friedman's Nutrition Equity Scholars Program. And lastly, equity also entails providing need-based scholarships and scholarships for students of color. And noting that need-based scholarships may overlook the issue of generational wealth that may be limited among certain minority groups. So to close, I want to end with the figure that framed today's conversation. And by now, you have a clear understanding of how social factors such as quality and access to education and economic stability, neighborhood environment, and how all of these factors impact diet and diet-related health disparities, as well as possibilities and areas for future research. So overall, to adequately address the disparities we see, more systematic and holistic approaches are needed, and it goes well beyond nutrition education and telling people what to eat and what not to eat. And as this image on the right shows, once you have a clear picture of reality, not everyone is running the same race. And this reality makes diversity, equity, and inclusion all the more important at this stage of our country's history. And we're arguably at a critical point, given not only the disease rates that we see and the economic burdens that many in the US face, but also the turning point that I believe the pandemic and George Floyd's death have highlighted. And this also means it's an exciting time to be in your shoes as the next generation of practitioners and public health professionals and researchers. So there are many unanswered questions and, more importantly, solutions that need to be created. So with that, thank you again for the invitation, and I look forward to the Q&A discussion. Although it will be brief, I welcome any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown, for such a wonderful and informative presentation, providing us with many, many important points to reflect on, especially within the field of nutrition and public health. This is such an important topic, and I would also like to take this time to highlight some work during Black History Month in 2022 from the Friedman School at Tufts, which I will share a link in the chat now on. And we have a couple of minutes left for Q&A, so anyone in the audience, please submit any questions you may have through the chat. To start us off, Dr. Brown, you've talked about the importance of race and ethnicity, social determinants of health in nutrition and public health research. So what are the challenges in conducting research in this field on health, public health and nutrition disparity? And what are the difficulties in measuring these social determinants of health, especially in the context of nutrition research?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And, as mentioned in my presentation, there are several root causes that really extend well beyond educating what people eat. And although that may be a part of it, that really we need multi-level and multi-sectoral interventions to address nutrition health disparities. So when looking at the socio-ecological model, for example, we need to work not only at the individual level, but also interpersonal, community, and at the neighborhood level. And then also more importantly, the policy level. So there are a host of policies and programs across the country that are ripe for natural experiment research. So for example, city level soda taxes or local level food policy initiatives. And when I was living in Boston, I did work with the Boston's Office of Food Access, which is now Boston's Office of Food Justice. And they're planning several partnerships and expansion of their programming, which is also ripe for research. So I think in terms of examining nutrition health disparities and looking at social determinants of health, it's really important to leverage existing policy changes and existing activities and building partnerships with community-based organizations that are doing this work on the ground. So just to give you an example of a study leveraging local level policy changes. So Dr. Caitlin Caspi, she's at UConn, formerly at the University of Minnesota. She's the PI on a study called the Wages Study, and they're leveraging the existing minimum wage increases across the country. And in her quasi-experimental study design, she's determining the influence of minimum wage increases on food insecurity rates, obesity rates, and other diet-related health disparities. So I think that's a promising approach for research. And then to your second question about the challenge around measuring social determinants of health, I think with any study that the issue of participant burden is always a concern, and wanting to make sure you're asking the right questions and including the right measures. So obviously that would be up to the research team. But at NIH, the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities, they've been involved with the funding of what's known as the Phoenix Toolkit. And the goal of this toolkit is to provide standard measures related to social determinants of health. And it includes both individual level social determinants of health and then also structural level of social determinants of health. So I would highly encourage researchers that are interested in the nutrition equity space to go to that website. But they include measures such as if someone lives in a food swamp, racial segregation and how to measure that, as well as other individual level factors. So again, I'd highly recommend going to that if you're in the research space, and I'll put that in the chat box now. But overall, I think looking at the social determinants of health and through the lens of nutrition equity is really an important and interesting topic to pursue in the future.
Yeah, I think that's great. And then thank you for sharing the link in the chat. I think that'd be some great resources for us to look at. And we have a question from Helen. Do you have any thoughts about the inequity in nutrition and accessing culturally appropriate and healthy food within higher education?
That's an excellent question. Now, just for clarification, is that within like kind of the academic environment and like cafeteria services within higher education? I guess that is I have a clarifying question. But, you know, I think with anything, there's a demand. If there's a demand for it, then they might be more inclined to provide that that service. But, you know, I know there are initiatives in diversities across the country that are trying to highlight, you know, more cultural foods. So New York City, for example, I know they have the new initiative to have either it's meatless Mondays and vegan food served within their education system. But I also think even in Boston and in certain areas in Cambridge that they had initiatives to highlight different foods of cultural backgrounds. But I think that's a great way to start. Like exposure at a young age is really critical, especially in shaping someone's dietary patterns throughout the life course.
Exactly. I think it's great to see some of these newer initiatives come out. We have another question from Charlotte. So what is the best way for us to develop and standardize interculturally competent decision-making of food types to honor our richly diverse neighbors?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think it points to, you know, really having patient-centered care or community-centered approaches and meeting people where they are in their communities. But I think it's important to not assume as well on what people eat and asking them first and foremost, you know, and that could be integrated into nutrition curricula or any education curricula that's developed, really starting from where the community is in terms of their eating habits and dietary patterns.
Yeah, and also along that line, you also mentioned the diversity in the field of dietetics, and thinking about that, especially in the outpatient practice, where clinicians help patients with their day-to-day diet instead of like an inpatient where it's more of a nutrition support type of thing. And we know that what we eat is so closely related to our culture, our race, and ethnicity. What are your recommendations for practicing clinicians and all the RDs who be out there when working with minority patients or patients that have a different race, ethnicity background than the clinician themselves?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And, you know, approaching any interaction with someone of a different background, it's important to have a level of humility, you know, and really knowing that it's a lifelong process. You know, there's this idea of cultural competency versus cultural humility, and I'm much more in favor of cultural humility. And again, it's a lifelong process of being open to another person and their experiences and cultural identity and not coming in with this preconceived notion on this is how they eat. So really, you know, having a patient-centered focus and approach, and you know, and that's how we're trained too as dietitians, to ask someone what they eat first. But I've heard time and time again different stories where they provide like cultural diets. They'll see someone's African American and provide like soul food exchanges, or you know, kind of tips for soul food, when you know the diversity in the Black population is very vast. And again, starting from the patient first, I think is key, and not making assumptions.
Exactly. I think that is such an important point. And just to be aware of time, so we're almost at time. And thank you so much for being here, Dr. Brown. This has been such a wonderful opening session for our conference. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We have 2 sessions at 1 p.m. One is a panel on precision nutrition, and the other is a workshop on spatial statistics with GIS and remote sensing. And we hope to see you there. And thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much.